everybody, please take your seats. I'm Roy Schatz. I'm Vice Chair, in charge of Vice for Mary Buter, who's the Chair of the Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation. And welcome. We're so glad to have such a good turnout. As a matter of fact, I may be bringing in a few more chairs, but there are sofas. We have a full 2-hour program of presentations on our work, and then lunch at 12. And then for those of you who would like to stay afterwards, the Michael Gallery has said if you're part of this room rental, you can have a free tour of the gallery, and I have in my pocket these things. If you want a tour of the gallery afterwards, I can give you stickers. We're starting off the program with Patricia Chow-Fraser, Professor Pat at McMaster University, has been doing research on Georgian Bay that I know of since 2003, and maybe earlier than that on the Great Lakes. She is a great friend of Georgian Bay Great Lakes Foundation and of everybody on Georgian Bay. She is an international expert on wetlands who is invited to conferences in other parts of the world. I'm very pleased to present to you Pat Chow-Fraser. Pat.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk to you about the research that we've been doing. And it's, I can't really take credit, I do, but they're really the work of all my graduate students, one of whom is here to, she's one of the newbies who's going to follow in the footsteps of. So I want to acknowledge James McMaster, who is a past PhD student, Dan Weller, who is also a past PhD student. Both of these gentlemen now have actually good paying jobs. James is now working at Department of Fisheries and Oceans, or I think they're now Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Dan is with Parks Canada up in Lake Superior. Lindsay Boyd is an Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources. She did her master's, and then Danny is here. She is a master's student, started in January. So I just wanted to let you see the outline of the talk, which is to see the coastal wetland vegetation and zonation, and then talk about indicators and wetland quality for Georgian Bay. That's going to be very short because you can see right away how they are distinctive. The effects of water level on wetlands and their structure and function. Then the monitoring strategies that we started to build with the good fortune of being able to partner with an organization like the GBA Foundation early on. We were able to build a lot of these foundational projects, which I'll show you, and then the effects of grass carp, which is the next big looming threat. That is actually the work that James McMaster did, but because he's now away and working in another job, I'm presenting for him. So the coastal marshes, so when I say wetlands, probably a number of different terms come into your head, maybe like a bog, or a swamp, sometimes people call them, but really what I'm talking about, a marsh. So a marsh is something that is on the side of a lake. It has open water. It's usually connected to the lake, which means that fish can swim into it. And that's really one of my major reasons. It's kind of an excuse to study the wetlands, because I'm interested in how fish have their habitat. So they provide habitat not only for fish, but also for reptiles, amphibians and birds, and these are all areas of interest that we've cultivated in our lab with different people developing projects. But really the foundation, really the trees in the forests, the vegetation in wetlands, those are the main components. Those are what provides the structure and then the function. So we have things like meadow species, floating vegetation that float on the water, emergent vegetation which emerges out of the water, and then really the key players for fish habitat are the submergent aquatic vegetation. A lot of times we just call them weeds. That's okay. They don't take it hard, but they certainly aren't a nuisance by any means. So they constitute this structure around the wetland, and they are quite predictable in that the submergent vegetation needs a lot of water, so they're more in the open area. Then you have floating on top of them, and then you'll have swamp or shrub-like species, and then you have upland, as well as meadows and emergence. And whether or not these components are there depends on the depth of the particular portion of that marsh. And there are three key variables that dictate whether or not wetlands can form, these coastal marshes. And one is called exposure, and that's basically how the wind and wave action, if it's too windy and wavy, there's just no chance for accumulation of the substrate, the organic substrate, to allow the plants to grow. If it's too steep, it won't also grow. If it's too shallow, it will grow, but it would also change quite a bit. And then the absolute depth at which. We have developed, as I said, we've developed a number of projects focused on the different species that live in these wetlands, and we've turned the information into indicators. So an indicator or an index is simply something like your blood pressure, right? So your blood pressure tells you something about how you're functioning, how your health is. So we have something called the wetland fish index, which is based on what kind of species are present, based on how tolerant they are to degraded conditions or pristine conditions. There's also the marsh bird indicator, which is something that we did not develop in our lab, but we've applied it quite a bit. The wetland macrophyte index is also developed in our lab. It's based on the type of plants that are found there. We also have the wetland zooplankton index, which we haven't used very much here because it's not actually as sensitive to really, really good conditions. So once it gets past a certain point, you can't really use it to determine if it's gone degraded or not. It's really good for the lower lakes where you have a lot of degraded conditions. Then there's the water quality index, which I use extensively. It is probably the one that can link everything, all of the different systems around the 5 Great Lakes. So we've used these indices along the way to assess habitat for muskellunge. We've published on this. We've also now starting to work on salamanders. That's the project of Nick Limas, who couldn't make it here today, but a lot of work is being done now to map the vernal pools around eastern Georgian Bay, as well as determine how good habitat is. And then also we've published a lot and did a lot of work on freshwater turtles. I'm going to talk mostly on the water quality and fish in this presentation, but this is a map that shows the water quality index being applied to over 150 different wetlands that we had visited. And really the main thing to note is that the cooler colors, the very good, the green and the blue, those are what we want. Any of these more moderately degraded, very degraded, warmer colors are indicating some form of degradation by usually human activities like agriculture or urbanization. And you can see that the sites that we visited in Georgian Bay between 2002 and 2010 show that most of those sites are in very good to excellent condition. And we have followed up with almost every 5 years now. We've gone back to a set of satellite or sentinel sites that we have reassessed, and we found that continue to be in good condition. But what we found is that the plant zonation is changing because of low water levels, sustained low water levels, and then more recently with the really high water levels. And that's affecting how fish communities are present in the wetland. Now, there is this interaction between the geomorphology, the slope of a wetland, and the water level. So this is just a diagram to show you For instance, if you have something where the slope is not constant down, depending on where the water cuts off, you're going to have different zones for the plants to grow. And if you have a constantly steep slope versus a constantly shallow slope, you're going to have different types of vegetation at different water levels. So, and then we also did quite a bit of work looking at uneven contours. So this would be a situation where this happens a lot in Georgian Bay. You'll have an outcrop of rock, and if water levels go below that point, then this becomes a stranded wetland. So it's no longer able to hydrologically link to the Great Lake, and then fish can't come in and they can't go out. I hope I've convinced you that water level and the interaction between the slope of the wetland is very, very important and has implications for the type of plants that are grown there. So here we have the forest, the meadow species, the emergent, floating, and so on. This is primarily above the water, so it's terrestrial, and then this is all under the water, so that's aquatic. And that's what makes wetlands, coastal marshes, so important, is that they have this transition area that is semi-terrestrial or semi-aquatic. And that's why it's so high biodiversity, because lots of different species use it. Now, in addition to that, the other term that I'm going to refer to is high marsh and low marsh. And this is the term that the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry uses to indicate high marsh is all the emergent vegetation that go up to the tree line. Whereas the low marsh is primarily the floating, submergent from the shore out to the open water. Now, for all intents and purposes, most of the time when MNR is referring to this low marsh, it goes out to only 2 meters deep. Now, we know that in Georgian Bay, it extends beyond that because we have actually scuba dived and found that there are plants that grow below that. But for the most part, the bulk of the vegetation is probably below the 2 meters. So if you have fluctuating water levels and it goes up and down, but really we're keeping a sort of a mean around there, then you're going to have no net change in zonation, because some years are high, it's going to benefit the submergent, but then some other years are low and it'll benefit the emergent. So it kind of cancels each other out. And over a 5 or 6 or 7 years even, that's okay. But when you've got sustained low, when you've got it low and it continues that way for 14 years, like what we experienced, then what happens is you're going to lose that aquatic vegetation, and it's going to move down towards, the terrestrial is going to move down and take up that space. And then what happened is we had net movements reflooding. So over the last 5 years, the water levels have come back with a vengeance, and now we have a reflooding. But after 14 years of establishment, those pine trees and those alders and other species are not moving. They may be dead or they may be dying, but they're not moving anywhere. But now we're starting to see decomposition going on, and there is now perhaps a net flux of nutrients out into the bay. So it's really important to understand whenever I see a wetland or whenever I see data on wetland, I say right away, if it's in Georgian Bay, what era is it? What time was it sampled? Because there's also a lag time associated with it. So if something happened, you have to kind of wait about 5 years before you can actually see anything substantive coming out of it. So we know that from previous study, when we went from a sort of naturally fluctuating system to a prolonged and sustained low water levels, we had changes in the fish communities. So this is the work from Dr. John Midwood, who sampled wetlands he wasn't present. He's stepping on the shoulders of a lot of other students. But we did a lot of sampling in 2003 to 2006 to show that there's quite a diversity of different types of fish. You can see here by all the different colors. And then after 10 years of sustained load, so another 5 years go by, we go back to the same sites and sample, and what we start to see is an extension of some of the species. So now you're starting to lose diversity. So we're getting mostly pumpkin seeds, because pumpkin seeds actually like the dense vegetation. So they're going to just be, expanding at the cost of some of these other species like the largemouth bass and some of the more desirable prey fish, like some of the minnows that muskellunge likes. So we know that fish communities are going to change, and so a lot of the work that we're doing now is actually trying to re-sample those same wetlands 5 years after the reflooding to see how they're changing. And preliminarily speaking, we are finding sort of a hybridization between these two types of communities. But most notably, what we found, which was really exciting this year, is that when we went back to Severn Sound, where after about 10 years of not finding any young of the year muskellunge, for the first time this year we found 3 of them in one of the wetlands. And those wetlands actually had more of that slope that was more suitable for. So we think that when we go back this year, we're going to be able to find more of these. So we've been doing this work now, as I said, since about 2003. We have 66 wetlands that we have now sampled in both periods. Danny and a couple of other students are now putting that into a manuscript for publication. But essentially what we're finding is that the water quality has actually improved, and that's because with the higher water levels, you're diluting some of those nutrients. And since the index for the water quality index is basically the nutrients, the concentration of nutrients, we're actually getting higher values for those. But what we're finding is that the WFI and the WMI scores, those wetland fish and macrophyte index, are actually lower. They're significantly lower because we're no longer finding the kind of fish associated with those plants. And where we actually should have found submergent vegetation at that appropriate depth is now actually meadow species that are just dying. So we've kept sort of these sentinel sites that we are sampling because previous studies have shown that these are sites that are vulnerable to change, and so we're spending more effort trying to sample them. But I'll just show you, this is the Key River. You can see here after the initial drop in water level, that whole river just kind of transformed into wild rice, and it was really, really quite amazing habitat. 2007, you can see here. This is in 2009. Now you're starting to see that the trees species are starting to come in. So the meadow marsh is dominating, and then there were eventually pine trees and shrubs. And then now in 2019, we flooded that pine tree zone. And the jury's still out on whether or not the fish are there because we can't sample the fish. Because where we used to set the nets that was 1 meter high for the fyke nets, now it's dominated by trees and we can't look at them. So I put in a proposal to the Ministry of Natural Resources to borrow one of their electrofishing boats so that we can actually get into deeper water. And so negotiations are ongoing, but it looks very good for us to be able to use their boats in 2020 during June to August. So the successional process, and this is a natural thing. That I don't want to give you the impression that this is something that's not normally found. It's natural in nature that we have these booms and busts along the coastal wetlands. It's just that we've got this unusual situation we've never seen before, where you've actually got another type of ecosystem moving in, and now it has to be completely moved away. Now, what has bothered us most is that this past year, when we went up to northern Georgian Bay, and this is in McGregor Bay, for those that don't know Iroquois Island, you can see that the water has gone up a lot more in 2019. And here's another view of the sites. You can see a lot more water there, so that's normally a good thing. But what has happened is that, as I mentioned, we're starting to see the decomposition occurring. And we think that it's now mobilizing a lot of those nutrients from those dead and decaying matter into the open water. What you see here are not plants. This is algal blooms that are now accumulating just underneath the surface. So that, when they decay, they also generate nutrients. And so it could be a bad sign for some of these fish habitats. And then the thing that really worried us most was when we went to Sugar John, which is an area that we love, at Beaverstone Bay. We always have excellent conditions in there. When we sampled there this summer, here's an example of a site as it was in 2009. You can see how low the water levels were compared to all of this flooding now. You can see that all the scores have gone down. So basically we have the WQ, except for the WQI, which I explained, goes up because you've got this increase in water diluting it. But you can see that the other scores for the wetland and fish are going down. But more importantly, in this back bay, which is now covered to about 1 meter deep, has now gone anoxic. When we put the fyke nets in there, we caught about 5 or 6 of the long-nosed gar, and they all perished overnight because there wasn't enough oxygen in there. So this is starting to tell me that decomposition is now taking over in much larger areas and may have more severe implications. And the reason why this is not having any problem with oxygen deficit, because it's got good flushing with the bay. But as soon as you start having this kind of socked-in area, and if you don't get that good flushing between the open water, then you get that stagnation. And at night, of course, is the time when you get the low oxygen, because both the plants and the animals are respiring, and they're taking up oxygen and giving back out carbon dioxide. Okay, so what we've come to understand, and we knew this even way back when, is that we have various parts of Georgian Bay. We don't just have one Georgian Bay. We have a Georgian Bay that's in the southeastern that acts very differently in terms of communities to the central part, to the northern part, and to the northwest. So we can start with a regional model, but it has to be something that can also account for site-specific slopes. So what we really need is a digital elevation model. Now, we've been probably saying this for the last, 20 years, right? We got to get that bathymetry done. And no matter how hard Mary and I would go to these meetings and say, let's get some bathymetry, it's never been done. So Dan Weller just got sick and tired of me telling him that. So he decided to spend 1 year of his life devoted to actually creating a DEM. So he created this, and with this, we're now doing a lot of modeling and simulation, which is actually bearing a lot of fruit. So we can now use the model. Remember the things that I mentioned, that the slope, the exposure, and the depth, okay? So those things those are things that can be measured in a GIS, Geographic Information System. And we can do that not easily, but we can do that. And we can do that for every pixel. So every 10 meter pixel, we can actually generate a depth for that, and a slope, and an exposure value. And on top of that, thanks to some some more forward thinking that we did and I can still remember this conversation, sitting with Mary. You can never be not busy when you're with Mary, because we finally did all of the surveys. We said we were going to do 100 wetlands. We finished it, and we're in the boat coming back. And then Mary says, "So now, Pat, what do you want next?" And I thought, what? Like, we just finished. I haven't even published a thing. And then she said, "No, we need to fundraise for the next thing that you need. What do you think you need?" And I said, "Okay, if you can fundraise enough money, we'll need to have an inventory of all the wetlands in Georgian Bay." So that was what she did. She went out and she got the donations that would allow us to create this, and we found out that we had more than 5,300 hectares of marsh habitat. That's that water part, okay? That doesn't count all the uplands part. We used a lot of Iconos imagery, we used a lot of QuickBird imagery and so on, and base maps, and we separated them out into 37 quaternary watersheds. Now this next slide kind of shows you why we can't depend on what's most readily available. Okay, if you look at this, now it's a little bit busy here, but the Great Lakes Coastal Wetland Consortium is a group that was created by EPA and Environment Canada, where their sole goal was to take whatever is available and put it all together to say that's what coastal wetlands habitat we have. Now, it was probably quite accurate for the southern lakes, Erie, Ontario, Michigan, you know, because a lot of work had been done in there. Plus, they don't have a lot left, so they could actually survey them. But then in Georgian Bay, look at what they said. Instead of 5,376, they said we had only 297 hectares, okay? And you can go all the way down and compare what they had and what we had. If we hadn't done this project, we wouldn't be in the table, because they basically said, oh, well, you only have 300 hectares. You know, you don't really deserve a seat at the table when we're negotiating. And many times, Mary and I would sit there and go, no, 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 you need to see what we have. And so finally, by 2010, we created this this inventory, and now it's used throughout the Great Lakes by the governments. So it's really, really important. The other thing that we get short shrift is that most of our wetlands are not very large. They're very small, average size of 1.4 hectares, many of them. And so in the lower lakes, I think that a long time ago it was probably like that too. There were lots of little ones, but then they just got developed, right? And they disappeared. So now all we have is very large ones. So we don't want to go there. Okay, we are in a class of our own. We don't want to go and group ourselves with people don't have a lot. We have a lot, and so we want to make sure. So most of our habitats are small, and because they are small, the minimum size for MNR to evaluate a wetland is two hectares. So if they're not bigger than 2 hectares, they won't evaluate it. Doesn't mean that they don't exist and they're not functioning the way that we want it to. So we need to do a lot of fact checking. When anybody does work for us, I always say, okay, where did you get the data? Do you have actually primary data source, or is it something that you just took from the literature because it's available? So we now have a lot of information. So one of the things that we're doing now is actually looking at the coastal wetlands, looking at how vulnerable they are to water levels based on those things like slope, what kind of fish are there, what kind of plants are there. We've identified areas of concern for us because we want to keep monitoring them. McGregor Bay, Henry Inlet, and this should be Severn Sound. This is not should not be Sturgeon Sound. And what we're finding is that if we go back to these areas, we can also sample some reference sites like Kalanak Bay, where there are lots of wetlands there that are in really, really good condition. And